Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Global Hotspots podcast. I'm your host for today, Miłosz Majore, and I'll be talking to my colleagues Eugene Chasovsky and Jared Jeter about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. As always, you can find a more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics in our weekly forecast monitor, which we publish every Friday alongside this podcast. Today, we're going to start off with a brief roundup, as always, of all of our major developments happening in each of the hotspots that we cover, which, as a reminder, are the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, as well as transatlantic ties in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And then we'll take a quick look at some of the developments out of the United States and Sudan. We'll then follow up with a discussion on an update on various fronts in the Americas, as well as a look of recent developments on the tech front in the Indo-Pacific. So with that, let's jump into our roundup. Eugene, why don't you start us off with the Middle East and the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Sure, thanks, Miłosz. So in the Middle East, we saw this hotspot trend towards the military escalation scenario this week, as U.S. forces conducted airstrikes in southern Iran on May 26th, which was reportedly to preemptively negate any planned attacks against the U.S. Or U.S. forces in the region. And then we saw the U.S. carry out additional attacks on May 28th, on Thursday, which is when we're recording this podcast. In response, Iran's IRGC has retaliated by attacking a U.S. base in Kuwait, so marking a tit for tat there. This comes as U.S. President Donald Trump said in a social media post on May 26 that an expansion of signatories to the Abraham Accords should be a mandatory component to end the war in Iran, which does not look to be, a signal of progress, at least at this time. In the meantime, we saw that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ordered the IDF to increase the intensity of its strikes against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and this is despite a recent 45-day ceasefire extension between the two countries. And then following those orders, we saw that the IDF actually did carry out numerous strikes, including new evacuation orders for Lebanese civilians and expanded ground operations beyond the yellow line in southern Lebanon. Then in the meantime, in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and we'll pull in transatlantic relations here as well, this hotspot has trended towards the military escalation this week, as Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov told U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio that Russia would expand its large-scale and systemic attacks against Kyiv, and also advised the U.S. to evacuate its diplomatic staff from the city. In the meantime, NATO bolstered its rapid response capabilities in the Baltics by assigning a combined German and Dutch Army Corps headquartered in Germany to the defense of Latvia and Estonia in particular. We also saw that Poland and the UK have signed a bilateral defense cooperation treaty on May 27th. And then in response to a cyber attack against a Lithuanian national data register, this actually resulted in the leak of over 600,000 data entries. And the Lithuanian government followed up by saying that a foreign country was thought to be behind the attack, but it did not attribute blame to a specific actor, though it's suspected that Russia could be that actor. And then finally, Ukraine is encouraging the EU to appoint a special envoy to Russia as part of an effort to reinvigorate peace efforts and to represent a united European front in negotiations, according to Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha.
Thanks, Eugene. And now turning to you, Jared, for the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, thanks, Miłosz. So in the Indo-Pacific, we've been seeing a trend toward the status quo as of late. The U.S. chipmaker Nvidia announced that it would invest over $150 billion annually into Taiwan's chip market, following similar pledges made this week by other U.S. microchip companies. The Taiwanese authorities have also apprehended individuals who have been smuggling advanced chips from the U.S. into China. The Dutch trade minister will also be traveling to China in July to discuss the tech export controls and disputed ownership over the tech giant Nexperia. The U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has also traveled to India to shore up ties, where he has signed a framework deal for critical minerals, although there are no major announcements made with regards to the Quad security framework with respect to China. Japan passed a new law establishing a new intelligence council as part of the country's national security reforms. And Japan also agreed with the Philippines to work on an agreement to share classified information, which would also would involve the transfer of weapons to Manila. And finally, North Korea has been testing new short-range ballistic missiles, integrating AI targeting and guidance systems as part of the country's new military modernization efforts.
Thank you both. So before we turn to our discussion, some other notable developments that we've been keeping an eye on this week outside of these regular hotspots have included the United States, where the Trump administration has announced that the US will now require green card applicants to apply for their cards in their country of origin as opposed to from the United States. Only those applicants facing, quote, extraordinary circumstances may be granted an acceptation, which would be determined by the USCIS officers reviewing individual cases. And this change, it should be noted, comes as a significant shift in a long-standing US immigration policy. And then in news from Sudan, we got a new Human Rights Watch report, which has revealed that Colombian mercenaries were trained by the United Arab Emirates forces in the country, so in the UAE, before being transferred to Sudan to assist with the efforts of the Rapid Support Forces, which, as a reminder, have been repeatedly reported to have committed widespread human rights violations. The report further implicated the UAE as a collaborator of these abuses, which the UAE has, of course, repeatedly denied. That's all for our brief for this week. So turning now to the discussion portion. So in searching for the topic of this week, we were considering touching on some of the developments from the Middle East, which obviously have been going on as normal this week, with some notable developments from either side coming from the United States and from Iran. But we also wanted to give ourselves the opportunity to touch on some topics outside of that theatre and perhaps closer to home in the Americas. So, Eugene, starting off with you, what is your sense on the overall picture?
Yeah, thanks, Milosh. So, as you said, right now, there's obviously a lot of attention on the U.S. position in the Middle East relative to the Iran conflict. And, we're seeing a lot of activity, both diplomatic activity, but now, as we kind of briefed out earlier in the podcast, some resumption of at least limited strikes. But everybody is obviously paying very close attention to that theater. And as that's happening, we're seeing a lot of important developments and a lot of important emerging trends happen in the Americas. And I'll just kind of list a few here because there's no shortage of things that we can discuss. But on the one hand, we see that Cuba has really kind of taken center stage in terms of U.S. focus in this region, in the form of the ongoing oil embargo, which has put a lot of pressure on the Cuban authorities. And now we're starting to see reports that basically there are at least preparations being made by the Trump administration for a possible collapse of the Cuban regime as early as this summer. And there could be some military actions or military operations that take place in that event or perhaps even preceding it. So that's definitely something to pay very close attention to. In the meantime, we've seen sort of growing, simmering tensions between the US and Canada to the north. So we've seen, obviously, Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada has, famously at this point kind of touched on the lack of, dependence on the United States in his Davos speech a few months ago, and the need for Canada to seek alternative or at least supplemental relationships with other countries. And we're actually starting to see that really come to fruition now, for example, with Canada announcing that it would be actually buying a fleet of Swedish military surveillance aircraft instead of going to the US for such aircraft. We're also seeing tensions over trade ties with the USMCA that's coming up at the beginning of July. And just a growing kind of tone of tension between the US and Canada. But then finally, I just wanted to point out very briefly, the U.S. has not lost its attention on Greenland. Obviously, that was kind of made the headlines several months ago when the U.S. was trying to either purchase Greenland or even potentially militarily take it over. That's quieted down to an extent, but the U.S. does remain active. And in fact, just this past week, there was a pretty important critical minerals deal that was signed between the U.S. and Greenland as the U.S. is seeking to diversify its dependence on things like rare earth elements from China. So, quite a lot going on there. I think, overall, the kind of connective tissue here is that even as the U.S. is focused on the Middle East and trying to end that conflict there, the Americas does continue to be a prime kind of theater for the U.S., in keeping with that national security strategy document that was released at the end of this year. And some of these, developments and trends, I think, could really be coming, higher up the ladder, if you will, in the coming months. So, listeners should certainly be kind of aware of that and paying attention to those theaters.
Yeah, thanks, Eugene. So quite a lot going on this side of the globe, as you mentioned there. So we could take some time to unpack some of that. So, Jared, I know that you obviously covered China quite closely, and you obviously pay attention to not only domestically what's going on, but also its relations with its trading partners. This news that China is shipping what seems like quite a substantial amount of humanitarian aid in the form of rice to Cuba. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so China is doing this predominantly for kind of two clear enough reasons. The first being that they want to show some solidarity to a longtime ally. China has long tried to support Cuba diplomatically. They've often had very strong relations in the past, as kind of stemming from their both positions as communist powers and both being somewhat oppositional to the U.S. However, one of the clear reasons why China is trying to do this is to kind of win the global narrative war here. If China can be presenting itself as a power that is providing humanitarian aid to a nation that the United States is actively blockading, then this is something that China can use for its internal propaganda, as well as to paint itself on the global stage as a more reasonable power that is concerned with the interests of humanitarian assistance to other nations. This can go a long way to be able to improve China's reputation globally, as well as to kind of paint the U.S. as a more antagonistic power, which is something that the Chinese regime is very clearly interested in doing. And also developing, kind of getting their foothold in Cuba as a major food importer. This will be something that will also, assuming that there is not a major shift in Cuban leadership in the coming months, this is also something that could potentially provide China the ability to establish a dependent link with Cuba that would permanently give it a economic foothold in one of the nations closest to the United States, which, of course, would also benefit their geostrategic position.
Eugene, what's your take on it?
Yeah, I think Jared brings up some good points. I would also add the element, when we're talking about humanitarian aid, the Russia component here, which I think is notable. So there was recently a shipment of, I believe it was, 700,000 barrels of oil that Russia wanted to send to Cuba, kind of in support of the regime, especially amid this U.S. Energy blockade, which is becoming really increasingly dire for Cuba. Notably, the U.S. actually did allow that shipment to take place. So it kind of goes to show, that the U.S. is kind of seeking some room to maneuver here. Cuba obviously has close relations with both China and Russia, but the U.S. is really trying to assert its dominance in the country while also kind of factoring in the humanitarian factor. It's right. It doesn't want to kind of create a situation where you have mass migration or a complete breakdown, or at least not, that would go against the interests of the United States. I think it's also worth kind of bringing up the Venezuela component here, which maybe could have some parallels for Cuba. So obviously, at the beginning of this year, we saw the U.S. Intervene militarily in Venezuela, another country where both China and Russia had a lot of interests in and a lot of activities in, and the U.S. really kind of made its presence felt there and actively tried to kind of get the regime to remove or at least lessen its ties with those countries. And notably, we are seeing a lot of the precursors that we saw in Venezuela happening in Cuba, including recently, the indictment of former Cuban President Raul Castro, who's now in his 90s. So, I don't know if there's actually going to be any action taken there, but it's an important legal step. We saw reports that, Cuba had amassed some drones that it could, potentially target the U.S. mainland with as well. So these are all, I think, important signposts to be watching for that potential U.S. military intervention. And it will be important to see how countries like China and Russia respond. Although what we've seen in Venezuela is that, beyond kind of rhetorical support and perhaps some humanitarian support, this is, really being signaled by the U.S. as its domain, so to speak.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the parallels and the signposts there. Although I do wonder whether it's clear that the U.S. has kind of been ambiguous, as would be expected, on its plans on whether or not to engage militarily with Cuba. It seems that from what you're saying with regards to letting in aid from Russia and China, that there is at least a part of the administration or of the U.S. apparatus that isn't too keen on destabilizing the country too much, and whether or not that would extend to, a military move of some kind, I guess the question remains to be seen. But is your sense that then the escalation is likely to continue ramping up on the hybrid section or the hybrid side of things, as opposed to the military one?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question, and I kind of maybe we can even take a look at the Iran situation as an example of this, that there's actually multiple simultaneous fronts going on, right? So you've got the military pressure on one hand from the US, although no action as of yet. The hybrid escalation, which comes in a very acute form in terms of that blockade, but there is an ongoing diplomatic process as well. And in fact, we've seen high-level talks, whether through Secretary of State Rubio, the CIA chief recently having visited Cuba. Talks are happening at a high level, and I think part of the U.S. interest is to get some kind of deal, quote unquote, with Cuba. But the U.S. is also, and Trump himself is voicing frustration with how those talks are going. So that's where either the hybrid and or potentially the military card can come into play, even as those diplomatic discussions are ongoing. So it is possible that we actually do see more progress on the diplomatic side of things. But I will note, those developments that I mentioned that are happening recently, it seems to be more trending towards the escalation standpoint. But we can't rule out the potential for diplomacy as well.
And I wanted to turn briefly to that item that you listed up top, Eugene, on the situation with Canada, where it is quite interesting to see that it's been a long time coming. In a sense, we saw some speeches made by Carney several times over the course of the past year, which indicated that Canada was willing to divest, at least on the security front, from the United States. And it seems like this is the first major move in that regard. I think it's interesting to see that the competitors to the Swedish military surveillance aircraft that you mentioned involved also Boeing. Boeing, which it should be noted, Jared and I covered on previous episodes, Boeing actually saw its shares tumble a little bit after the Trump-Xi meeting in Beijing because of there was less of a commitment from China to buy those Boeing jets from the United States. So here as well, I'm curious to see how that will impact not only the Boeing shares themselves, but also the United States themselves. And I think that this is a case where the Trump administration may not take too kindly to this. We also know that Canada is reconsidering its purchases of F-35 jets from the United States. It currently has an order placed for 88 of them, and it's received the first batch of some of them, but it's willing to re-examine whether or not to continue. So I think this may be a cause where we might see some form of retaliation from the United States, perhaps on the hybrid escalation front. Curious to get one of your guys' thoughts on that.
Yeah, for the recent order kind of dispute between the F-35, one thing that's very important to note about the F-35 specifically, and this applies to other countries as well that are having diplomatic spats with the United States, is platforms like this, new advanced platforms like the F-35, actually can't operate without American command codes, which are not shared with the countries that actually purchase these weapons. So that is definitely going to play into the way that these countries decide to have this dispute, because even if they receive a batch and then decide to worsen relations with the United States, that might actually end up losing their access to the platform as a whole. So we might see some more moderated behavior from American allies, just so that they don't lose complete access to this very expensive weapons platform.
Well, it looks like that. Just wanted to add that, like, that might be one of the reasons that Canada is indeed reconsidering that, to avoid that potential choke point. Eugene?
Yeah, so I think it's an important point. So as we're tracking these types of tactical shifts, I think we're also kind of keeping an eye on the strategic big picture as well, right? And there was a notable development from last week where actually amid these tensions between Canada and the Trump administration, there was an announcement out of the Pentagon that it would actually suspend participation on the Permanent Joint Board on Defense. And this is actually something that's been established for over 80 years. It brings together U.S. and Canadian defense leaders to talk about strategy, on the military front. So that's quite notable. And then even as that's happening on the security side of things, as we've already discussed, there is some effort at, I wouldn't necessarily call it, replacement of the U.S. I think the U.S. and Canada will continue to be very kind of deep trading partners just by virtue of their geography and their history of relations. But we do see Canada, for example, looking to export some of its energy supplies, LNG, especially amidst the cutoff from the Iran war, to Europe. In particular, there was a deal that was signed with Germany to export some of Canada's LNG from its Pacific Coast terminal to Germany. So really interesting. It seems like Canada is really kind of focusing on the European vector or other allied countries. So it's not like a complete departure from its Western ties, but certainly we're seeing more and more of those divisions or tensions grow between the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah, and absolutely from the European perspective, I think you're seeing a lot of the same where a lot of countries are very cognizant to the fact that they are still very dependent, and none of them want to cut ties completely on an immediate timescale. But I think all of them are starting to understand that hedging everything on just that one partner, the United States, may not be the best strategic position. So we're definitely seeing some bridges being built there. And you mentioned LNG exports, which I think is a good segue onto the topic of critical minerals, which is something that is quite key to the United States and Greenland negotiations. We've seen that over the past year, especially since, the Trump administration has made it one of its big priorities was diversifying away from China with regards to critical minerals processing and export. And it's notable to see that while those tensions initially persisted between the US and Greenland, it seems that at the moment there's some kind of progress being made. Whether or not we'll actually see any kind of deal, concretely speaking, anytime soon. So I think it's good that we've covered today quite a lot of these developments on the Americas side of things, and it's undoubtedly, as we mentioned, a part of the world that is inevitably going to keep recurring in our coverage. So stay tuned as some of these stories unfold and develop. We wanted to turn now briefly to the Indo-Pacific. So there's been a number of developments regarding the technology front. So as Jared, as you mentioned up top, as a whole, the hotspot itself is fairly much on the status quo at the moment. But on this tech front, we've been seeing some developments. And I wanted to start off by talking about this situation where it looks like Taiwanese authorities have apprehended 3 individuals that were suspected of smuggling advanced Nvidia microchips into China through Japanese ports. And this is quite notable, I think, because one of the main stories we've seen over the past year with regards to China and technology has been that China is quite keen to wean itself off of US dependency with regards to advanced microchips. And I should say that the ones that were smuggled into China at the moment were not the H20 and H200 chips, which have been authorized by the US to be sold to China. These are even more advanced ones. So what's your sense, Jared, on what that says about China's ambitions with regards to all of this?
Yeah, China's chip ambitions are actually pretty similar to what the United States is attempting to do at the moment with the CHIPS Act. China, for a very long time, has been largely dependent on places like the United States and particularly Taiwan for its more advanced chips. Now, China has long since been the major supplier of legacy chips. They've been the ones controlling the majority of the market in terms of chip production. However, the most advanced chips have, of course, that monopoly has long since been controlled largely by Taiwan. And much like the United States, China is trying to wean itself off that dependency. China wants to be able to make itself chip independent. And part of the position that puts China in a really good place to be able to dominate this is the fact that they already control much of the refining that are necessary for chip production. Gallium, germanium, they control already most of this already. So if they can make themselves chip independent in terms of advanced chip production, then they would be able to dominate the global market, but also eliminate almost all of the global dependency that they have. So being able to acquire large quantities of advanced Taiwanese and American chips to be able to reverse engineer them is a very critical geostrategic consideration for the Beijing government.
But so that question remains of why is it that we're still seeing some smuggling of those more advanced chips if one of the things that China's trying to do is not be reliant on?
Because right now, China does not actually have the capacity or the sophistication in their industry to be able to produce these advanced chips at the same quantity that they are seeing from Taiwan and the United States, particularly Taiwan. So they need to be able to make up the shortfall with chips from places like the US and Taiwan while they develop their own industry. Because as controls are becoming tighter, as restrictions are put on them more and more with advanced chips, they're starting to see a shortfall. They need to be able to bridge that gap as a stopgap measure until they can achieve their own domestic chip production.
No, that's a good point. And it should be said that it's not the first time that China has sort of employed the use of essentially looking at what the US is doing and trying to replicate it to the best of their ability. And we've seen it. I mean, we mentioned the F-35s in our previous point of discussion. You know, that was unveiled in the 2000s, a couple of years later, we saw a very similar jet design, the J-20, coming out of China. So it's likely that there's some of that going on here. And as we're talking about Nvidia, one thing you mentioned was the massive investment that it aims to provide to Taiwan. I believe the number is around $150 billion a year that it wants to invest in Taiwan's AI industry. What's your sense on why that's coming now and what kind of effect that's going to have on the industry as a whole and on Taiwan?
So this is kind of a two-way street here. Nvidia is beginning massive investment in Taiwan for the same reason that Taiwan has begun massive investment in the American Chips Act and American chip manufacturing. Like, on the surface, you might question, why would Taiwan and America invest in each other's industries when they're trying to, become more independent? And one of the primary reasons is they're trying to gain a foothold in each other's countries to be able to maintain their relevance and that dependent relationship. Because if America becomes entirely independent of Taiwanese chip production, then Taiwan would become a lot less relevant to defend, and their autonomy would be a lot less relevant to defend on the global stage. It's the same thing in reverse. The United States corporate machine wants to be able to maintain a lot of relevance inside of the Taiwanese market because Taiwan right now is a chip monopoly. There's not too much leeway on that. So if Nvidia can successfully break into the Taiwanese market and develop a very dependent relationship, then that's something that's going to be able to make them a lot more relevant in the broader Asian and global markets. So they want to be able to maintain that. There's also just like the short-term analysis that AI is booming right now, and the companies that can first take advantage of this early advantage will see a lot of short-term profits. And right now, with Taiwan holding this position that it does, being able to establish and to some degree control the direction that their AI development takes will grant the companies that have their foot in the door a massive amount of early leeway in this developing industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And it should be noted that Nvidia is not the first to do this. I think it was last week that AMD, which is another US microchip company, pledged $10 billion in Taiwan's AI sector, which is obviously, a fraction of Nvidia's. I mean, the number that Nvidia's pledging is more than most countries' defense budgets. We're talking $150 billion a year, starting from 2030 onwards. And the CEO, Jensen Huang, hasn't given any kind of timeline on how long those investments would last, but certainly very notable. And I think that, placing myself in Taiwan's shoes, apart from the obvious benefit that this brings the industry as a whole, I think there's some chance that this will further incentivize, as you mentioned, Jared, the United States and the Trump administration to really commit to the defense of the island, which, as we know, is enshrined in law and is nevertheless going to happen. But at the same time, we know that the Trump administration is very focused on those trade deal side of things, and the fact that for the past year, one of the big things that the Trump administration has been doing is essentially trying to rack up some of the benefits and some of the revenue that is made by foreign sales by these companies. I think brings a personal stake and a financial one to the Trump administration in protecting the island.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And right now, what we're seeing is as Taiwan is becoming increasingly less relevant, as their tech monopoly begins to fray just a little bit, as countries like China and the United States begin to develop their own domestic chip production, Taiwan is attempting to be able to make itself more relevant with burgeoning industries that are becoming increasingly important to the stability of the tech industry, particularly in this instance, AI. So a lot of the corporate machine in America recognizes that, and they don't want Taiwan to ever become more economically aligned or subservient to China as a result, because that would massively destabilize the global tech industry. It would put it would put in their eyes too much power into China's hands. So this isn't just about geopolitical concerns. There's a lot of just economic self-interest that is playing into this from the corporate side. This is like most likely what is driving a lot of NVIDIA's decisions here. Because they are very reliant on Taiwanese chips. They need Taiwan to maintain its current geopolitical position. So making the United States more intertwined with the Taiwanese economy is going to protect their bottom line as well as protect Taiwanese autonomy globally.
Yeah, and I mean, Taiwan's definitely going to stay relevant for a while at the moment. And, while China definitely has the ambition to catch up, as does the US autonomously, it's likely that, as you mentioned, especially with this investment boom, that Taiwan is going to stay as the primary player on the scene globally. And just to wrap this story up, one of the things you mentioned up top was the story of the Dutch trade minister visiting China. And we've covered this in the past, but there has been this burgeoning tension between the Netherlands and China with regards to chip making. So what's your sense on why the announcement comes now and what it means for the relationship?
So, one of the big reasons why this announcement is coming now, a lot of people might wonder why the Netherlands specifically is so important to this story. The Dutch based lithography company ASML is one of the global monopoly holders of the type of lithography machines that are necessary for chip production. And right now, China is trying to kind of hedge its bets on where it can get the most value from. It's trying to develop its own chip industry. It wants to become more independent of the US and Taiwan. And they're hoping to kind of exploit the broader break between the United States and its NATO allies and the European Union to try and get the type of expertise and industrial control that it needs to be able to advance its own industry. So, if needing to kind of let bygones be bygones, in regards to a certain Dutch trade minister that once made statements towards China about the Uyghur genocide. This is something that they're willing to overlook if it means that they can get the type of industrial control that they need to be able to advance their own industry and particularly drive a wedge further between economic wedge between the U.S. and its allies. So that's what's kind of at the heart of this kind of dispute. The Netherlands is kind of a little bit weighing its options here. The Netherlands is still, of course, very integrated with the United States. It doesn't want to break from them fully. It's trying to kind of decide how it's going to be able to navigate this because the Netherlands does absolutely have a lot of diplomatic disputes with China. So we're kind of seeing the two countries try to navigate each other's interests as the global system kind of realigns, what with America's position becoming more tenuous within the European Union in a diplomatic sense. So we're going to be seeing how this is going to develop. But right now, I would say that China is going to be looking to be able to advance its own industry, even if it means dealing with some people that were once unacceptable to them.
Yeah, and I should note in terms of context that that the Dutch trade minister in question, he did recently voice some opposition to a recent push by the United States to enhance some of the tech restrictions to the US that is undertaken by its allies. So, the Netherlands has always been slightly against restricting its access to the Chinese market, but kind of went along with it with regards to broader strategic aims. But clearly, with some of those signals coming out again, I'm sure that China will want to capitalize on that. So that visit is scheduled for the early weeks of July, so stay tuned and join us back there at that point to hopefully hear a development on that story. But with that, we'll have to wrap it up for today. And as a reminder to all of our listeners, if you'd like a more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to all of these topics, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates all around the world. Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Eugene. Thank you all for listening, and take care.
Thank you.